Hello, this is Justin Williams with the Wolfpacker podcast. I'm joined today for another edition of the Hoops Talk podcast with co-host Brian Geisinger. He's also a co-host on Sports Channel 8, the radio show on 99.9 The Fan in Raleigh. He's also a co-host of the Buzzbeat podcast covering the Charlotte Hornets and is a writer and editor at theaccsports.com. So he's well-versed on all college basketball, NBA basketball, but for this purpose, we're going to be talking NC State hoops. And before we get too far into this podcast episode, this podcast is brought to you in part by JFQ Lending. With interest rates below 3%, there has never been a better time to lock in a low fixed interest rate on your mortgage. You'll never need to think about refinancing again. Set it and forget it. And with JFQ Lending, you are guaranteed to get the highest level of customer service. They have an A-plus rating with the Better Business Bureau and over 3,000 five-star reviews. Give Hunter Clausen a call today at 480-513-3992 or email Hunter directly at hclausen@jfqlending.com. That's HCLAUSSEN@jfqlending.com. JFQ Lending, Inc., Equal Access Lender, licensed in over 40 states, www.jfqlending.com. While you're at it, head over to thewolfpacker.com and use promo code PACK60. That's promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. Obviously, we're in the thick of ACC conference play in both men's and women's basketball, although the women's team is taking a 2-game break due to a positive COVID test within the program. So they'll be back in action hopefully next week, but NC State men's team obviously in the thick of things. Miami coming up. They just had a 74-70 overtime loss to Clemson in overtime in Little John Coliseum on Tuesday. And before we get kicked off with Brian's thoughts on what happened in the past week of NC State basketball, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, pretty much everywhere you listen to podcasts. And of course, you can always stream us on thewolfpacker.com. So again, subscribe, rate the podcast, and give us a 5-star review if you don't mind. So Brian, let's talk some hoops. Obviously a lot going on in the country this week, but hopefully this can be a little escape for most out there to talk about some NC State hoops, some lighter topics out there. NC State, another, coming off their positive ending to 2020, they beat Carolina for the first time at home in 8 years. Followed that up with a close win over Boston College at home. Another 79-76 final score, back-to-back 79-76 wins for the Wolfpack to open up the ACC play. And then they were really tested a couple days ago on Tuesday when they went to Little John, a place that they've really struggled with, the past 10, 15 years. It's been kind of a thorn in their side playing Clemson on the road. And always a pretty competitive game ever since really Keats has been in the program with Brad Brownell over there at Clemson in his 11th year. But Clemson, a very competitive team, right now, probably the best team in the ACC, sitting at number 19 in the AP top 25, probably going to go up after this week if they can handle business on Saturday, assuming that they have a game. But NC State, good performance, led for about 35 minutes of regulation, but ultimately let the lead slip there at the end, lost by 4 points in overtime in a very competitive game. So I think that's a good place to start, Brian. I'll talk about the Boston College game with you a little bit, but Clemson is obviously a little bit fresher on our minds and obviously probably a bigger impact on the season going forward. There's a lot of outside talk about, this game being kind of a heavyweight contest between two teams that could, contend for an ACC title this year, maybe the regular season, maybe in Greensboro at the ACC tournament, knock on wood, later this March. But yeah, fingers crossed, Brian. We're all hoping to get to Greensboro in March. Just get to the finish line, right?
Yeah.
But my question for you, Brian, is if you're NC State, do you take more good from this game, considering the fact? And I asked Matt Carter the same question after the post-game podcast that we did, but do you take more good from the fact that you were leading for almost 36 minutes in regulation and there was a lot of positives to take away from the performance in Little John? Or, do you kind of look back and think, man, they're going to look back on this game and think this is one that they really should have come away with on the road, an opportunity that they're probably going to be kicking themselves for down the road. So what do you make of Tuesday night?
Yeah, I lean towards the first, but I do think this is I lean towards the first option, though I do think that this is a game that, was certainly winnable, and maybe they'll be frustrated if it influences seeding or, the resume for the tournament or anything like that. But look, there's no shame in losing by 2 points on the road in overtime to a top 15 team in the country, a team that has probably one of the 5 best players in the conference in Amir Sims. Not that he didn't play great the other night, but also has, by some metrics, the most efficient defense in terms of adjusted efficiency in the country in Clemson. And they're 1 or 2, depending on what site you are referencing. So there's no real shame in losing to a team like that, I don't think, especially since State was also down Braxton Beverly, the guy, their senior starting guard that gives them some shooting and some help stabilize the offense a little bit. This game did sort of made me think of, there were 2 big themes that I sort of took away from this game. And maybe neither of them apply if Nick Honor doesn't have some sort of out of body experience and just go nuts. But it was obvious from the jump this season. Obviously you knew Sims was going to be good, but watching the tape of Clemson play in that holiday tournament that they had down in late November in the Melbourne, Florida area, the Space Coast or whatever that tournament was called, Space Coast tournament, that Nick Honor was going to be a big addition for them. The 2-way guard, physical defender, who can create his own shot. And he was obviously amazing against State. But I think I've talked with you about this on this podcast before. Like, the chief concern I had with State heading into this season was, okay, no Markel Johnson. So who is the half-court engine for this team when they can't get up and down and play in transition and force turnovers on 33% of their possessions? Like, when they get into a slugfest of an ACC game or going up against another top 50 team in the country or whatever, who creates offense for them down the stretch when it turns into a half-court game? And like, Devin Daniels has been pretty awesome so far this year. And like, he gets to the rim. He's one of the best guys in the conference of getting to the rim. He's got good size. He can shoot over people. He's tough to guard because he's got all those kind of like quirky moves inside of 10 feet. He can jump off either foot. He can use the glass. And like, over the last 2 seasons, Devin Daniels has been a pretty good pick and roll creator. I just thought Markel, while up and down at times, over the 3 years that he paired with Kevin Keatts, was a pretty good pick and roll decision maker, pick and roll shot maker, even though the shot may have dipped off a good bit last season. So Daniels has helped, and so certainly has a healthy Braxton Beverly. And so maybe it's a little disconcerting that he got hurt during warmups of that game. Cam Hayes' pull-up shooting has been incredible so far this year. He actually ranks in a smaller sample size here. He actually ranks in the 99th percentile nationally in terms of efficiency shooting off the dribble this year. And Shaquille Moore has been terrific too. But I just thought the decision-making in the half-court offense, the final 10, 15 minutes of the game, including overtime, they were not at their most efficient, and I think some of that is just Clemson's defense is really, really good. And Devin Daniels threw a couple of bad passes that, like, he'll definitely play better the next game. He's an awesome player. He's having a great season too. So I don't think there's any need to like lose trust. And that's certainly why I think you can take more positives away from this game than negatives, or sort of looking at it as a glass half empty situation. The second big theme that I would take out, I think it was it's way too reductive to sort of point out one thing and say, well, this is the reason why they lost. It was this thing happened at this time in the game and this cost them the game or won the other team the game. That type of analysis just it isn't usually applicable. But if I could sort of point to like one of the major things that happened to State in this game that was unfortunate for their chances of winning, it was Jericho Helms fouling out, right? Like, Jericho Helms only played 27, 28 minutes in this game, and he's had some up and down shooting performances. But even when he struggles to shoot the ball, you and I talked about this after the UNC game, his ability to guard Garrison Brooks in the post, his ability to stretch out opposing defenses, because he's like a pretty good 3-point shooter and he's a pretty good pull-up shooter. And his ability, and we saw this against UNC when the Tar Heels were trapping those ball screens for his ability to slip into space, catch a pass, dribble it once or twice, get it to Bates for the front of the rim for a dunk or a layup, or kick out to the weak side for an open 3-point shot. And when he got knocked out of the game because of foul trouble and fouling out, all of a sudden State lost not just like their best stretch shooting option in the front court, which he is by a great degree, even though we saw Thunderberg step out and hit a pick and pop three, which would love to see more of it. It's just at this point, it's sort of a tough item to bank on. But he's also their best guy to get the ball in space and rotate it and get it to the second side of the court. And I thought against a good Clemson defense that wants to keep the ball on one side of the court when they're guarding pick and roll, State was basically just playing right into Clemson's hands. And unfortunately, in a couple leverage situations, they had bad turnovers, but those would sort of be the biggest themes, was that like without Helms, they just look different. And in this specific matchup, it was not, they needed his shooting and his playmaking down the stretch, and it was sorely missed in this game.
Well, late in the game when, Helms fouled out, clearly a big
terrible call, moment. By the way.
Yeah, that one was questionable. Call. I mean, technically I saw the left hand, slightly push off. So I can understand the technicality from the ref standpoint. But in that moment of the game, I mean, that kind of a touch foul, it just wasn't consistent with the physicality of the game as a whole. So that was one of my comments in the post-game podcast, is that the officiating, I thought, in the ACC this year has been better without fans, because there's just less just less context. They're able to focus more on the game.
The psychology factor is real, it is.
But there were 2,000 fans in Little John, and you could hear them on TV. It was kind of weird. It was almost like NC State's first true road environment game last year. I mean, I know they went to St. Louis in December on short notice, but there were no fans in St. Louis at that time. And granted, it wasn't a full Little John Coliseum. It could obviously have been a lot more rocking, but you already have the artificial crowd noise, and plus you put in 2,000 ravenous Clemson students into that building, and it's going to be more of a hostile environment. But down the stretch is where you really missed a senior guard in the backcourt with Braxton Beverly, who unfortunately was hurt before the game. We don't currently know his status moving forward. It didn't seem like there was anything that Kevin Keatts was super concerned about. Obviously, he wants Beverly to get back on the court as soon as possible. I wouldn't be surprised to see him return to the lineup as soon as Saturday against Miami, but no additional information beyond that. The big question going into that game is whether or not Manny Bates was going to be available. That was the positive for NC State, is that they had Bates. A game that, and I think it was kind of an afterthought going into that game, is that NC State fans were so excited to have Manny Bates in the lineup. It was kind of like, oh yeah, well, sucks that we don't have Braxton Beverly. Well, down the stretch, I'm still a believer that Cam Hayes is eventually going to be the point guard of this team, that they're going to have to start trusting in those situations. But he's still only 3 games back in from missing over 3 weeks there in December due to the COVID situation in the NC State program. And so he's still getting his feet wet again. He still really hasn't returned to the level of production that he had before that pause. And he's still a freshman. I mean, this is still like the 6th and 7th college games that he's ever played. So, he's still building that trust with Keatts to eventually take on that role. And when Devin Daniels really has to become the byproduct point guard in those late game half court situations, it really becomes a situation of, you see where Daniels clearly can create with the ball in his hands, but it's better if he's coming off of a screen as opposed to bringing the ball up the court past the perimeter or past the midline. So, I think the Daniels turnovers late in that game, there was 3 very costly turnovers. Obviously, it kind of stole the narrative of what was a pretty good night for him all around. But all in all, you just can't go. I think they went the last 7.5 minutes of the game without a field goal. It just, you can't do that against a team that, as you mentioned, is a top 15 team in the league. I mean, we look at Clemson, we see the 19 number next to their name and thinking, okay, it's a good Clemson squad. It's a team that, should be a tough game, but I don't think people are respecting the Tigers like they should be right now, which is, if the tournament were to start today, I mean, this would probably be a 3 or 4 seed in the big dance. So, I mean, what do you make of Clemson? For NC State fans leaving this loss, do you think Clemson is the best team in the ACC as we sit here today on January 7th?
Yeah, and just real before I address that, one thing I meant to read this off before we moved completely off of Helms, but
Mhm.
Helms played 28 minutes in that game. NC State was plus 2 points in those 28 minutes with Helms on the court. They scored 1.08 points per possession. It's a pretty good number against a very good defense with a +5 net rating. In the 17 minutes without Jericho Helms, NC State outscored by 6 points. Obviously, they lost by 4, and they scored just 0.9 points per possession with a minus 22.7, or pardon me, 22.7 net rating. And all those 17 minutes were with DJ Thunderberg and Manny Bates on the court together. I think you and I have also discussed that at times. Like, I don't think there's any question those are 2 of their 5 best players, and they're 2 of the veterans on the roster. They can be better than that together. It's just like some matchups offensively, those lineups are going to be a little challenged. You know what I mean? Like there's less shooting and playmaking on the court. So that's something to monitor. State's been kind of like not great in a very limited sample so far with Bates and Thunderberg on the court together, but we need to see them play together more before they were pretty good together last year. So let's just give it a little bit more time. As far as Clemson goes, like, not only this team is going to be really, really tough, I think for 3 reasons. I don't think they're the best team in the ACC at this very. I'm still going to go. I'll go down with Virginia, I guess. I still think Virginia. At the preseason, I thought they were the best team. They beat Wake last night. Not like that's anything to write home with. Wake's not very good, and they're having a tough season. They got absolutely crushed with COVID and didn't play basketball for over a month. But like losing to Gonzaga, there's no shame in that. And I like Virginia's depth and firepower offensively. I don't think this is like a traditional Bennett team defensively. But with Huff protecting the rim and with their offense, like I still think they can be pretty damn good. And Reese Beekman, their freshman guard, is a pretty strong on-ball defender too, even though he sort of platoons with Kihei Clark. But Clemson's right there. I use all of that to say Clemson's right there. And they're really, in my opinion, they're really tough for 3 primary reasons. The defense is just great. They have an elite defense, period. Like they don't block a lot of shots. They don't force, crazy, I guess they do force a lot of turnovers. Like if you saw the FSU game, they played, like the FSU Clemson game the other week was crazy because it was like both teams were picking up basically full court. The entire game was just like transition possessions going back and forth. It was funny, but they force a lot of turnovers. And on the other side of the court, they have Amir Sims, and they shoot a fair amount of threes. And so like the math is going to be in their favor a good bit because like they're elite defensively, and on the offensive end, 42% of their field goal attempts this season are threes. So like the math is going to be slanted in their favor. And a guy like Amir Sims he's a tough matchup. Manny Bates is probably the best defensive center in the ACC. One of the best defenders in the country. But like Sims is a tough matchup because he can pick and pop into space, and he can handle, and he can really, really pass. And even though Sims, I don't think he scored in the first half against State, but he had 3 assists off. He got it in the pick and pop. He dribbled a couple times, and then he picked out someone, and he assisted on a bucket, all in the first half. So like they're going to be tough to match up with because of Sims, and the math is going to be in their favor because they have a good defense, and they take a good like volume of 3-point attempts. So I don't think Clemson, like I don't think they're the best team in the ACC, but I don't know. Talk to me if they continue this up. And UVA continues to sort of like sputter over the next couple of weeks, we can have a different conversation. But for right now, I still like UVA's offense. I like their talent level, and I think Tony Bennett's one of the better coaches in the ACC. Although I think Brad Brunell's having a great season this year as well too.
Well, NC State's going to have more of these opportunities to have, top tier ACC matchups on the road in the month of January. I know a road trip to Virginia is going to be coming up in the month of January. Also a road trip to Tallahassee to play Florida State, going to be going up to Syracuse, and a road trip to Chapel Hill to play Carolina in the Dean Dome. So there's more of these games on the way. And the biggest question for NC State is, are they going to be able to learn from a game like this Clemson game and, eventually turn these types of close contests where they lead for a majority of the game? Are they going to be able to close out these games and come away with wins? One positive that you really have to take away from Tuesday night, and credit to NC State for doing this, but I mean, they really shut down Amir Sims for 30 to 35 minutes of that game. I mean, he finished with 8 points, but all 8 of those were in the final, I think, 15 minutes of the game. 4 of them at the end of regulation, and then 4 of them big points in overtime that flipped a 1-point NC State lead to a 3-point Clemson lead. And it's really where Sims's smarts kind of came in, because when he had those 4 points in overtime, he pretty much bullied Manny Bates in the post, knowing that he had 4 fouls, knowing that with Helms already fouled out of the game. I mean, Bates was probably told in the huddle, like, you cannot foul out. Like, we cannot afford, because at this point, Keats has identified he's got 3 usable bigs that he feels comfortable with using in the front court. That's Helms, Thunderberg, and Bates. And when you've already got one of them on the bench, you can't afford for another one to go to the bench at that point in the game. So, credit to Sims for having the wits to do that. Would have liked to see, Bates maybe get a little bit more aggressive there, but obviously, a game that you weren't even supposed to have him. I mean, he was a game time decision. So there could have been some fatigue involved. There could have been some hesitancy with the foul situation, but ultimately we know Bates is an elite defender and he's going to bounce back from those types of situations.
Yeah.
I want to talk about go ahead.
PJ Hall scored right on top of him with a hook shot that I guess almost sealed the game too. That was another one where you're like, I think of Frisky Bates with fewer fouls to his name. I just think he defends this differently. And it was a tough shot. Like it wasn't like a poorly defended shot, but like Hall hit a really tough hook shot, right over the top of the best or second best shot blocker I think he and Huff are sort of right there. I think Bates is a little bit better of a rim protector, but yeah, to your point, like, I just think different game situations you're getting, I don't know, maybe that shot is just contested a little more strongly and it's already a tough shot. So maybe, it becomes a little more tougher and doesn't go in, or hell, man, sometimes that's just the way these things go. Like basketball's a make or miss sport. And so, yeah.
Well, it was a tough shot, but not to mention it was a lucky shot. I mean, it should have been a brick. It screamed off the back of the rim and then bounced like 6 feet up in the air and eventually swished through the net.
Yeah.
So a matter of fortunate circumstances there for the Tigers. Would have been interesting to see what NC State could do with one last possession down 2 as opposed to down 2 possessions. But nonetheless, one that NC State's going to need to put behind them and learn from moving forward. I do want to touch on the Boston College game a little bit, because in our last Hoops Talk podcast, I think I was underestimating the Eagles a little bit, just getting caught up in their record. But when you did a little bit more research, as I did before that game, you realize Boston College had some tough competition in the non-conference slate, had played some teams tough. And as you saw even last night when they went to Cameron and had a 15-point lead on Duke, but eventually lost by, I think, a point or two. Boston College, they're a good team. They just haven't really been able to close out games and get victories. But NC State, came out to a big lead in the first half, let Boston College shrink the lead a little bit before halftime. Boston College wins the second half, but eventually NC State made the winning plays necessary, just as Clemson did on Tuesday night, to come away with the ACC win at home. What'd you make of that Boston College game? I know it was in 2020, which seems like 10 years ago now. The year that we never thought we'd leave, yet somehow still upon us. But Boston College had some players. They shot the ball very well, especially compared to how they've been shooting the ball this year. They shot 43% from 3 and took 23 of them. I know that's an area that NC State prides itself in on the defensive end, not just forcing turnovers, but pushing opponents off the perimeter and forcing them into taking 2-point shots as opposed to 3s. But what'd you make of that game? Was that, just a gritty performance down the stretch by an NC State team fending off Boston College? Or do you think that was one where maybe they should have pushed that lead a little bit more and won that game by a wider margin than was the case?
Yeah, it feels like that's a game they probably should have had by a little bit more of a comfortable margin than they did. We're up how many points? 15, 16, something like that in the first
Yeah.
half, like
Yeah.
that at home. But like this is something I brought up when we talked about the other week. Like, I know this Boston College team, the record is bad. They're winless in the ACC, but they're materially better this year than they were a year ago. They have better players. They added a bunch of guys in terms of grad transfers. You saw a fair amount of James Karnak and Rich Kelly, who really helps them as a shooter from the guard position. Mekhi Ashton Langford is eligible. He did not play in the Duke game, which they were taking it to Duke during the first half of that game last night. Boston College is going to be a tough out for a lot of teams, in part because like they play this sort of tough 1-2-2, 3-2 zone that has some matchup tendencies and can be disguised to look like it's a man-to-man and then, flip into zone. And it's hard. And like at times, both Duke and State struggled against it. Louisville, I thought I had a little bit better of a game plan, although it helps just to be able to like take David Johnson, take a future NBA guard and stick him at the nail and say, we're going to throw it to you and like, please make the right decision. And David Johnson's an excellent player. So he did that continuously in that game, but like, it's tough. On paper, they do not appear to have a very good defense, but I do think it's like, it can be tough to score against them when you can't run your normal stuff in the half court. And it's not even like a normal like 2-3 where you sort of know like what you're going to be able to do, what spots are available to you. It looks a little bit score on, and then offensively, like they do a pretty good job of just like spreading you out. Like they shoot a lot of threes. This is a much better shooting team than they were one of the worst shooting teams in the country last year. I think they're top 90 in terms of effective shooting this year after being outside the top 300 a year ago. I think close to 46% of their attempts this season have been threes. So they do a good job spacing you out. And like that can be tough to defend. Like they carved Duke up in that game. And you impactful defender. I did think Bates before he left had some just awesome flashes in that game. Like I really did. He had a possession in the first half where it was the exact kind of pick and roll defense. You're like, God, if he could play like this, like there's no doubt he's an NBA center. Like just perfect drop defense. Ball got rotated after the first pick and roll. Perfect drop defense again. Then he blocked a shot at the rim. And it was like, God, it just everything Boston College wanted to do on that possession, this dude took it away. And man, that's not easy to do. And he's very talented and like I think is also a pretty smart defender too. But so it was unfortunate when he was knocked out of that game. But yeah, I think BC is tougher than their record.
My apologies for the interruption there. We just had to restart our Zoom because of some technical difficulties on our end. But as Brian was talking about, we were just breaking down the Boston College game, and Brian was making some good points about Bates's involvement. But that made me thought of just, you would have liked to see NC State maybe win that game against Boston College by a little bit more, considering they had the sizable first half lead, got up to 15 points at one point. But you consider the context of Bates leaving that game early in the first half with an injury, Braxton Beverly not having his best night, Devin Daniels not really having a characteristically good night for him. And then you think about, NC State losing the turnover battle for, I think, the first time this season against Boston College. The perimeter shooting wasn't particularly good. I mean, when you look at the box score of how it all unfolded, obviously you would have liked to see NC State do good in all those areas and win the game comfortably. But when you look at the box score, Boston College probably won the box score. And when you're able to come away with the winning plays at the end to come away with that victory, advance to 2-0, I mean, it is an encouraging sign that NC State can, win those types of games, something that, isn't necessarily something that the program has experienced a lot here as of recent. And I think maybe, Keats being the guy in his fourth year seems like some of that tendency to panic in those types of situations has gone down quite a bit. But another thing I took away from the Boston College game, and one thing that was, echoed again in the Clemson game. We already saw it in the Carolina game and the St. Louis game. You're seeing now sort of a pattern that NC State is consistently winning the first halves of games, particularly the first 10 or 15 minutes of games. They've been jumping out to leads. You saw it in the St. Louis game. You saw it in the Carolina game. Carolina, I think they were up as much as like 17 at one point. They really could have stretched that lead even more. But then you see the other team maybe take a little run at the end of the first half, something we didn't see in the Clemson game. And then you've seen the opponent consistently in these past 4 games I've talked about outscore the Wolfpack in the second half. And finally, obviously they paid for it in the St. Louis game with their first loss of the season, but they really paid for it Tuesday night against Clemson, not being able to close it out in regulation, eventually losing in overtime. And I wrote a column about this on the wolfpacker.com. Good excuse for use that promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial, and check out the column on NC State's second half difficulties as of recent. But what do you make of that, Brian? Is that, just a good portion of this roster being youthful? Is that maybe, getting back into the momentum of things now that they're 4 games back in after, the extended break there in December? Or is it maybe, a sign of one of the weaknesses of this NC State team and what's to come, and the fact that, it seems that the other teams have just had more success than NC State in the second half, and NC State's wins have just come when they've been able to make enough plays down the stretch to hold that off?
Yeah, I think part of it can be certainly attributed to youth and just a disjointed, weird season. It's weird for everyone. And like, from our vantage point, it's probably just impossible to sort of gauge, even as 2 guys covering and following the team and watching all the games. And, you're talking to the players and coaches in these Zoom conference calls, but like it, even sitting on doing, being armchair QBs, like we're trying to do here, like, we have no idea just how much this is impacting guys, not just their like conditioning and physical health, but their own like psychological and mental well-beings too. Like, it's not easy for anybody. What I will say though, specifically to like on court, was I do think like the loss of Bates was big in the second half. Like, Boston College scored, was very efficient offensively. The second half, they scored over 1.3 points per possession. That number doesn't have to mean much to you. Just know it means they were scoring at a very efficient clip. And obviously no Manny Bates in the second half. That is a bit of a loss for sure. Even if you still have plenty of capable defenders, and you've still got Shaquille Moore, who I feel like you and I haven't talked about him enough on this episode. Like, he's been awesome. He made plays in the loss to Clemson, hit a couple threes, had a really nice block in that game. Like, Shaquille Moore is awesome. He continues to be really, really fun and good and enjoyable. But yeah, I just like, defensively, I think this team can be very good, but you got to have Bates on the court to hit your ceiling defensively. And even if Boston College is going to stretch you out and make it tough, even if Bates is on the court, just his presence at the rim is such a game changer, and he's pretty mobile and pretty good against ball screens. So not having him was big, similar to not having Helms down the stretch because of fouls against Clemson was a bit of a blow too. So it's really easy, or I think, to look at these 1 game samples and again try to find sort of like one thing you can point to. And I really think it's a lot of things adding up, but part of it with the Boston College game is just like, they were missing their best defensive player, and the Eagles sort of went crazy in the second half and scored at a very efficient clip. They shot a fair amount of threes, which that certainly helps. Matters too.
Well, great minds think alike, Brian, and you read my mind. You forecasted perfectly where I was going next, which is, we've already talked about the last 2 games, and we've kind of broken down the team as a whole, if you will. But I do want to talk about some of the individuals on this team, especially over these last 2 games. And I think you have to start with Shaquille Moore, the freshman phenom who, has been called fearless, who's been called a bulldog, lives up to all of these types of adjectives and names. I mean, he's just tough. And for a freshman, to see a freshman play with that type of confidence, especially once he's gotten into ACC play, I mean, we didn't even really see it in the non-conference slate. We saw the defensive potential, but he never really got comfortable on the offensive end, had struggled with some turnovers. And yeah, there's still some weaknesses in his game. There's still some areas of his game that can use improvement as he, progresses his college career here at NC State. But this performance the past 3 games to open up the ACC slate, I mean, it's as good as you could expect from a freshman guard playing his first 3 conference games at the Power 5 level. Of course, he had the phenomenal scoring night against Carolina, 17 points in 15 minutes. He got hot from 3. But then the Boston College game, one of 3 double figures in scores in that game was relied upon down the stretch when Braxton Beverly was fouled out. That was the difference between the Boston College game and the Carolina game, is that down the stretch, Keats went with his veteran guys. He had the luxury to go with an all veteran or upperclassman lineup. In the Boston College game, Braxton Beverly fouled out, I think, with about 7 or 6 minutes to go. It wasn't his night. And really, Keats had no choice but to play at least one of his freshman guards. And that night, it was Shaquille Moore. Ends up working out because he hits the game-winning shot, the pull-up jumper from the top of the key with about 26 seconds to go. And then, of course, adds the exclamation point dunk that was kind of blocked, maybe hit the rim a little bit, but we're still going to count it as a dunk. It led for the 3-point win. And he's just come up big in big moments. I mean, whether it was on the offensive end to close out that Boston College game, or whether it was the block on Nick Honor at the end of regulation and Littlejohn on Tuesday to force overtime. I mean, if he doesn't get a hand on that ball, the way Honor was shooting the rock, I mean, you have to assume that that's probably going in. So just, can you give some perspective as to, at this point in the season, is Moore making as big of an impact on NC State as any other freshman is on their respective teams in the ACC right now?
It's tough to say. Scotty Barnes is involved in so much stuff that FSU is doing. He helps unlock their switching actions defensively, and he's one of their primary creators on offense. But Shaquille Moore is super important to what NC State is doing. I mean, he's their best. Is he? I would say right now that he's their best perimeter defender. He's their best event creator on the perimeter. He's still top 10 nationally in steal rate. We will see where those numbers eventually level out to, but his steals numbers have been off the charts, and 2 blocks against Clemson were pretty incredible too. But yeah, I mean, he is a ferocious competitor. I feel like he looks around. I felt this especially in the Carolina game. Like, that dude looks around and he sees guys like Caleb Love and RJ Davis. You see some of these other blue chip recruits, and he thinks that these dudes are no better than I am. And he competes with incredible verve. And I really don't think it can be sort of stressed enough. He's a phenomenal athlete for a point guard. Like, you don't get too many athletes that look like this. I would love to know what his wingspan is. My guess is it's plus a couple inches beyond what his height is. There's one still, I think it was in the Boston College game. It's like a sideline out of bounds pass, and he broke in front. The way he broke on the pass was incredible. It's so easy to borrow the football cliche, right? Like a defensive back breaking on the ball, but that is what it looked like. But on top of that, he has the ability to extend the arm, just uncoil that arm long enough to deflect the pass, then the speed to go catch up and get it. And I think he almost punched one down on either Mitchell or Karnick, but they fouled him instead. Just given his ability, his twitch, his athletic burst, his ability to jump, his strength, and his wingspan, like, he's just a really impressive defender. Just has all the makings of a guy that can really be a terror on the basketball. But you have to be careful of where he's located off the basketball, because he can break on passes. He can get the balls that you don't think that he has the chance to get to. He is a special athlete at that point guard position, and really has the makings of a damn good defender on the perimeter. And I just think there was a period of time where I thought, man, everything you get offensively from this guy is just gravy, but he's proven to be very efficient in the pick and roll so far, as has Cam Hayes. Both those guys have been good in the pick and roll and good shooting off the dribble, but the catch and shoot game is good. You feel pretty good about those shots going to now, and he's able to get an open catch and shoot look. And I thought one of the plays that was really important to sort of take note of just to backtrack to the Clemson game was in the first half, they ran pick and roll with Bates Moore was weak side in the corner. I think it was Daniels and Bates ran it. And like when Bates dove to the hoop, this is something to keep an eye on with Bates going forward. When Bates dove, whomever was guarding Moore in the weak side corner, I think it was Nick Honor, that defender compressed in, like sucked in from being closer to the 3-point line to being like, I can't let Manny Bates, who's rolling down to the rim, I got to be careful. Can't let him get a dunk because, he's going to dunk it and that's going to fire them up. He came in, Daniels kicked it out to Moore in the corner, Moore splashed the shot. And it's like that's just easy offense. And that's exactly the offense that like Kevin Keats wants to run. Like to have that guy in the middle of the court that has gravity, that can draw defenders in, and then you can play slash and kick off of that is huge. And Moore and Hayes being like capable shooters on the dribble, off the catch is terrific. Yeah, Shaquille Moore's been wonderful. He's super fun to watch. And I feel like the game takes on a different energy when he comes in the game, because just like he's in there to make stuff happen. Like you're gonna feel his presence when he's out there, even if he is the the shortest guy on the court.
And he's looking really comfortable in the corner on those perimeter shots, particularly. I mean, he's been shooting lights out in these last 4 games. I think he was 6 of 9 in the last 3 entering the Clemson game. He shot 2 of 4 from the perimeter against the Tigers. But it seems like a majority of those have come specifically from that like camera side corner shot. And it was left open on him in that Carolina game consistently. And you've seen as the games have gone on, the opponents are starting to scout and say, okay, we need to put a hand in this guy's face. He's still making them though.
That's also exactly what you want, because the dunk that he got over Kessler was, he caught it. And I think maybe it was Brooks that had to close out. Someone had to like scramble, close out on him hard, because they know like, hey, this guy can make that shot. And like, he can put it on the hoop and get to that. Him hitting those threes is great because it keeps defenses honest, and he can use that to get to his catch and go game and attack closeouts. And then if defenses have to rotate, well then boom, drop pass to Bates or Thunderberg right at the rim for a finish too. Like it just, that kind of second side offense that Moore is providing is really big, and makes some of those lineups that really appealing when State can put, combinations of Daniels and Hayes and Moore and Beverly and Helms, when they put those guys out there, because all of those guys can handle and pass. And so yes, I still do think this team is like, eventually the hope is that you find someone to become the primary initiator for them, even though Daniels is sort of stepping into that role and Beverly's been a caretaker. But to be able to dot the perimeter with multiple playmakers around that, with Bates as your rim runner in the middle, is it's a really interesting offense. It really is. You don't have to drop anything too crazy, and State really just does want to run pick and roll. So I think you need to have guys like Moore that can catch and shoot and attack closeouts for that offense to really hum as well as it can.
Yeah, Moore's seen his minutes creep up here over the last 3 games. He had 17 against Carolina, 26 in the game against Boston College, and then now a season high 32 minutes on the floor against Clemson. Now, granted, some of that is based on the context of Braxton Beverly fouling out late in the Boston College game and not being available against Clemson. And also Clemson was an overtime game, so 45 minutes of body versus, 40 minutes. So more opportunity for the taking there. But because he seems to be a bit ahead of schedule, if you will, on the offensive end, everybody knew he was going to be a good defender. Maybe they didn't know he was going to be as good as he has been, but the offense has certainly been a pleasant surprise for the Wolfpack here as of recently. If he keeps playing like this, I mean, do you have to find ways to keep him out on the court for longer periods of time? And do you think he's a guy that eventually Keats is going to have to start him? Because, I mean, you look around, it's a crowded backcourt. All of these guards are going to get some time in Keats' rotation. He's going to keep him rotated, particularly the way he plays. But you look at a guy maybe like Thomas Allen, who's got the experience over a guy like Moore, but you see more defensive upside in Moore, I think. And then you look at the offense, and really Moore's been producing a little bit more even on the offensive end, whereas you expected Allen to be a little bit more involved on offense, and he just hasn't really seemed to get it going yet. You could say that it is going to improve eventually, but again, Moore keeps playing like this. Is he eventually going to take that role?
It would not surprise me. I mean, Allen's still important because even if he is a little one-dimensional offensively, like that dimension is an important one. Like he can shoot threes. And I mean, but if Shaquille Moore continues to make in the, the upper 30s of his threes, then yeah, then we got to have a different conversation. Um but Allen and Beverly, those are the two catch and shoot guys. So you do need, if you're gonna have a variety of playmakers out there, it is good to have lower usage guys like Allen, and his, like, he's still 3.5% steal rate too. So, but yeah, I think I think Thomas Allen is sort of like the obvious guy if you were to take, move one guy to the bench and bump Shaquille Moore up to the starting lineup or whatever. But you touched on this too. Like, all of these guys are going to play. I think they're all ACC caliber guards, that's a luxury to have it, to look out and say, we have a handful of these guys. They can all play and everyone sort of brings a slightly different skill set to the table. So it's good to have options, and it matters more who closes the game than who starts. I mean, we can talk about it's not that starting doesn't matter. It does matter. It matters for the players. There's just a certain vibe and importance that comes to it. But really, just in terms of, I think, impacting like wins and losses, and if you're really trying to, like, get into the nitty gritty, like, who's playing the leverage minutes, right? Like, that's what matters more so than who's starting. But I think there's the ability to play all of these guys together. We've seen even Cam Hayes and Shaq Moore have played 57, 58 minutes together so far this season. I'd like to see that number continue to go up too, because that's the future, right? Like, that's the future backcourt for this team. But good for them to have options. And yeah, for right now, I think the more playing time for Shaquille Moore, yeah, the better. He continues to earn it on both ends of the court.
Well, let's move to the front court. A guy that's been playing really well in these past two games, now that he's finally returned after almost a month off in the month of December, is DJ Thunderberg. I know we've already talked about Manny Bates and Jericho Helms and flashes here, but DJ Thunderberg leading the team in scoring in these last two games, 21 points, a season high for him against Boston College in his return on December 30th. And then he had a 20-point performance against the Clemson Tigers on Tuesday in 27 minutes. Really efficient from the free throw line, particularly against Clemson, 9 of 9 from the strike against the Tigers, and was really the only guy that was making his free throws with some consistency for this NC State team down in Littlejohn. What have you seen from DJ Thunderberg in these past two games? Obviously, the offense has been there. It's been kind of weird situations. He was out without Bates in that Boston College game. He had to play stretches without Helms on the floor. And, of course, the senior in the backcourt and Braxton Beverly in the Clemson game. So what do you make of him, particularly on the offensive end? And then I'm curious to get your takes on, what he's bringing to the table on defense, because I know you like him as a defender too.
Yeah, I think, and I think DJ's defense has been a little up and down this season, but you've sort of said it, his offense has been awesome. I mean, he has been a total beast for NC State, inside 10, 15 feet, shooting 76% on twos. He's shooting over 86% at the rim, with including 2 dunks, over 90% from the free throw line. He's drawing a good number of fouls, 10% offensive rebound rate, which is basically right where he's been at his entire career. He has just been a total force at the rim, in the paint, and finishing and getting to the line. Like, it just is a great offensive player. The thing that is tough is, which we've mentioned even on this pod before, is like, if his best stuff comes at the rim, it is tough if Manny's down there too, right? Like, the spacing can be a little bit of an issue. And that's why ultimately, like, with those guys on the court this season, offensively, State actually hasn't been that efficient, even though both of those guys are efficient paint scorers. Just there's some positional and spacing overlap. But DJ's a good player. Like, he's got a good face-up game. You even see every once in a while, I feel like we saw this a couple times last year, he can even bust out a little big man Euro step in transition to, like, he's skilled. And I always have wanted his 3-point game to take off, because I think he has like a nice face-up game and he's got nice shooting touch, but just hasn't really come online. And maybe at this point, it's probably asking too much for that to happen. So I think when you play those two guys together, when you play Bates and Thunderberg together, and you want to stagger them, and that's why they bring DJ off the bench. It makes staggering a lot easier. But those guys are going to play together, and that's going to require DJ to handle the ball. It's going to require him to open up and be a little bit of a playmaker, which DJ has not recorded an assist so far yet this season. So like when he gets the ball, like we're looking to score. But like that's got to change. And I thought when I was sort of talking about their deficiencies once Helms went out against Clemson, I think this was an issue. When teams ice or trap ball screens and Thunderberg's the 4, it's gonna be tough to score at times in the half court, I think. And it's just something to keep an eye on. Defensively, I just think Thunderberg's like a great communicator. I thought that was sort of obvious last year. Like he talks a lot. You can hear him even when there were fans still in the stands. You could hear DJ talking on defense last year. He's just has good spirit, good energy. He's not he's not really blocking a lot of shots at this rate anymore. But he has the ability to protect the rim. I do think when you play he and Bates together, it can sort of make the matchups a little weird defensively. DJ can switch and guard perimeter positions. Like he has guarded 1 through 5 in his career. And even in the Miami game last year in Raleigh, like State shut down Chris Likes by having DJ Thunderberg switch on to him out of the pick and roll. So like he can do it. He can guard smaller, zippier guards with the basketball, but it's not sort of his natural position. And I thought at times against both BC and really Clemson, just like DJ playing that like flex 4 position, opened up a couple gaps defensively, but I like his communication levels defensively. I like his spirit. He's a good defensive, he's a much better offensive rebounder than he is defensively. But I think part of that is also, playing with Bates and stuff like that too. And just State under Keats in part because of how they switch is never going to be a great defensive rebounding team in general. But DJ's offense is so important to this team, even though I think they need to get a little bit more out of him. And I think defensively State can be very big and very tough to score against at times. I just think some nights the matchups are going to be tougher than others. Well,
you've seen with Thunderberg in these past 2 games that the scoring production has come in flurries. He had 17 points in the first half against Boston College, was much more quiet in the second half against the Eagles. And part of that may be due to the fact that he hadn't played in a month. So there was a fatigue element involved. He talked about that after the game, that, he felt comfortable out on the floor, but he was worried going into that game about his conditioning. So had to play 30 minutes in that game without Manny Bates for a majority of that one. So maybe, some explanation there as to why the production went down a little bit in the second half. Then you look at Clemson, and he really wasn't getting any attention for the first 15 minutes of that game. He ended the first half with a 5-0 run of his own to give NC State a 7-point lead at halftime, and then scored 15 of his 20 points in the second half and overtime combined. But, considering how efficient he has been, not just from the field, but his ability to draw fouls, get opposing players in foul trouble, and score from the foul line, do you think NC State needs to make more of a purpose in getting him the ball, particularly, depending on the matchups? Because it seems at times that when this NC State offense, particularly in half court, starts to lull, it's because they're settling for jump shots, and that's all fine and dandy when the shots are dropping. But clearly they weren't at the end of that second half against Clemson. And, maybe that's the time where you really have to lean in on your experienced big man.
Yeah. And like he's been, and so sometimes the best offense for State these last 2 games has been you just take a shot and let DJ go get it on the offensive glass. Like he's rebounded close to 15% of NC State's misses over the last 2 games since he came back against Clemson and Boston College. And, BC's playing his own, so it's a little bit easier to get in there and get offensive rebounds. But like we have 3 years worth of data that says DJ Thunderberg's a great offensive rebounder. So some of this stuff is like, just run your stuff and he's going to find the ball. He has a nose for it, and he's a darn good putback. He's always been a very efficient putback shooter since he arrived in Raleigh. In minutes when Bates sits, yeah, like and you're playing 4 guys around DJ in the middle. Yeah, run pick and roll, post this guy up. And if extra attention comes, let him kick out. You have all of these 40% 3-point shooters. Thomas Allen, Braxton Beverly, Shaq Moore, Cam Hayes has been a strong shooter. Devin Daniels, great offensive player. And I think Daniels and Thunderberg, especially last season, had real chemistry in the pick and roll too. I think both those guys played well together when State ran those side ball screens with those two guys. So yeah, if you have this type of like efficient offensive piece, this guy that can really, really score from, down on the block and inside 10, 15 feet. Yeah. Find ways to feature him. Especially because like State's a good offensive team, but not a great team. So if you have a guy like this, yeah, it's not like State doesn't have a lot of post ups. They don't post guys up that often. And that's okay because post ups aren't always the most efficient use of a possession, but finding ways to target this guy in the pick and roll, especially when Bates is out of the game and there's more space at the rim and you're not going to be as good defensively, it's probably a good use of DJ Thunderberg. Make him the best bench scorer in the ACC, turn him into that kind of weapon. I think a lot of times we think of those guys as being, guards that shoot a lot and use pick and roll, but why not have it be a big guy like Thunderberg that can face up and that can score out of the pick and roll and, hit the offensive glass for stuff too. But yeah, DJ is deserving of as many offensive opportunities as he can get because he's been very, very efficient so far this season.
Well, we'll see how they continue to use DJ Thunderberg. We'll see if Shaquille Moore's offensive hot streak continues into more just his overall identity in ACC play in the upcoming weeks. We'll see if the Wolfpack can figure out how to win some second halves here in January because they're going to need to. It's the toughest part of their ACC schedule. Next game is Saturday, January 9th in PNC Arena at noon against Miami. We still don't know if Chris Likes is going to be available. Obviously, they're probably their best player this year. Miami, a team with some pretty solid expectations going into the season, but a tough start for the Hurricanes, 0-4, but the last 3 have been by 2 points or less against, good teams. They've played Carolina. I think Virginia Tech was one of them. Clemson was the other. So
yeah, Florida State too, which was also a 10-point game or whatever. So, or pardon me, not Florida State. You had it right. Virginia Tech, Clemson, and North Carolina. Pittsburgh is the one ACC team that sort of like blew them out of the water.
And Pittsburgh's feisty.
They beat Syracuse without Justin Champagnie last night, who is definitely their best player. But Miami, like the thing to remember about Miami is like they have good talent. Even without Chris Likes, they have good talent. Isaiah Wong is one of the best pick and roll scorers in the country in the ACC. State's going to have to shut him down. I think you can do that because he's not like a great playmaker. Like he wants to be able to create his own shot off the dribble. Earl Timberlake's one of the best freshmen in the conference. Not super efficient, but man, is he athletic and skilled. Matt Cross is a good stretch 4 freshman for them that I really like and has played pretty well in ACC play. Harlan Beverly is a really interesting 2-way guard, a big point guard that has some defensive chops. But when these two teams play, just get ready to see a lot of pick and roll because no one runs more pick and roll in the ACC than NC State and Miami. So it's going to be a lot of spread ball screen action. And yeah, guys like Thunderberg and Bates are going to have to be, ready to roll because they're going to be asked to do a lot defensively in this matchup.
Well, I know it's not necessarily the game that NC State fans had circled on their calendar for the month of January in terms of high key matchups, but it's going to be an important game for both teams. Big difference between a 3-1 or a 2-2 conference record, particularly when it's so wide open. So for NC State, this is an opportunity to prove that they're here to contend for the conference and that they can bounce back from tough losses like Clemson. And then for Miami, they're just scraping to get their first ACC win, but a team that is better than their 0-4 conference record when you look at them at the end of the season. So I think NC State's going to get Miami's best effort on Saturday afternoon. It'll be interesting to see how it all unfolds, but that concludes our Hoops Talk podcast for this week. We'll certainly have Brian back soon because there's obviously a lot of great competition coming up in the month of January. So we'll get him back on after a couple more games here to break down some more stats and analytics on the NC State roster and some of the individuals, what's going on with them. So be sure to subscribe, rate, and review this podcast wherever you listen to us. We're on Spotify, Google Play, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to podcasts. And you can always listen to us on the Wolfpacker.com. While you're on the Wolfpacker.com, use promo code PACK60 for a free 60-day trial on all of our premium content, news, and analysis. Be sure to follow us on social media. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow Brian personally at bgeis_bird on Twitter. Follow our main account at the Wolfpacker, and then you can follow me personally at Justin H. Will. Like us on Facebook, NC State Wolfpack on the Wolfpacker.com. And for Brian Geisinger, this is Justin Williams, and this has been the Wolfpacker Hoops Talk podcast.